Okay, so let's get going with our second session with Saxena, who is the Director of Compliance Governance at Moneris. He's responsible for ensuring that Moneris is compliant with both payment card network rules and industry regulations. He has led and been a part of several key initiatives that have helped Moneris transform over the last 10 years, including the introduction of Discover and Union Pay payment card acceptance in Canada. Please put your hands together for Vi.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the Precise team for having me here today. I really appreciate it. But really what the story here is today is that the networks, when I refer to the networks, I mean Visa, MasterCard, Discover, Union Pay, Interac, Amex. They want the industry to move away from deprecated technology and move towards newer and more secure technology. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why and why that makes sense. And I know that not only in this industry, but most industries, I'm kind of putting my engineering hat on, that the sentiment tends to be that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So what happens is that companies and technologies tend to stay stagnant, and nobody really loves change. You kind of have to drive people to make change. And I'm thinking about what Sarah was saying earlier. It's important. It's important to explore new technologies, especially for the reasons that I'm about to talk about, which is actually disincentivizing old technologies. So for today's agenda, we'll talk about some of the compliance mandates. I know that sounds a little bit dry, and mandate is kind of a scary word, but we'll talk about what they mean and how these impacts might impact your business. And then we'll have an opportunity for a Q&A where Luigi might help me out a little bit. So before we get into kind of everything that I'm going to talk about, I want to paint a little bit of a picture of what a transaction looks like. Before I was in payments, I took for granted that a transaction occurred at the payment terminal, which is the device where you tap your card, insert your card, swipe your card, and it gave me a response back, and I was happy with an approved response, and I was unhappy with a declined response. But 10 years ago, when I first started working at Moneris, I got into the inner workings of how a transaction is actually processed. And there's several steps. And it starts with a card and a card holder. And the card holder walks into a retail establishment or a parking garage or what have you, or even in an e-commerce environment now. And they start out by using the card at a merchant. And that merchant uses a device that is typically sanctioned and owned or operated by Moneris and certified by Moneris. And then that device sends a message to the next step, which is the network, the payment network, Visa, MasterCard, etc. Visa and MasterCard send that data over to the issuing bank. And the issuing bank is the bank where the symbol is on the card for that card holder. So when we go and retrace all of the steps from this very handsome card holder, we have to realize that at each step of the way, data is being passed from one party to another party. And every time data is passed between parties, there is an inherent risk in that data being compromised. And we're going to talk about two technologies. One is an older technology called MSD, which is magnetic stripe data, which I'm sure everybody's familiar and has seen a credit card with that black stripe on the back. That is the magnetic stripe. And then the newest technology is called EMV, or chip data. And EMV is just an acronym that represents the three companies that introduced the protocol many years ago, Europay, MasterCard, and Visa. But it's casually referred to as chip technology because there's an integrated circuit chip on the card, the little gold chip that everybody sees that's so prevalent. And chip is the newer technology, MSD is the older technology. And really, the mandates that I'm about to talk about, over the years, for the past about 10 years, since chip has been introduced in kind of the mid-2000s, the payment card networks, which Visa, MasterCard, et cetera, have been disincentivizing the use of the older technology and encouraging the use of newer technology. So there's going to be some lingo in here. Please, raise your hand if you have questions about anything that perhaps doesn't make sense, or we can address it after the fact. So the mandates have largely been introduced by all of the payment card networks. So we're going to focus on some of the key ones here, the biggest ones, Interac, Visa, and MasterCard, really. And let's get into it. So the first one was the Interac chip mandate. And you can see some of these dates are 5, 6, 7, 10, 11 years ago. But this is all to say that issuers and acquirers must use EMV technology. So the first mandates actually started with not the payment terminal and not the card holder, but the fact that the issuers and acquirers, the banks and the Monerises of the world, had to support EMV chip technology. That started December 2012, where all Interac debit cards and banking machines, it was applicable to debit cards and banking machines. Then it was expanded to all payment merchant terminals after the fact. And then in January 1st, 2016, no terminal was allowed to accept Interac if EMV was not supported. I don't know if anybody's noticed, but you cannot swipe your Interac card anywhere. It doesn't work. And then there was a set of contactless mandates that were introduced by Visa and MasterCard. Contactless being tap. It's kind of the industry lingo. We call it contactless. There's no contact, typically, in a tap transaction. And this started in January 2012, again, about 11 years ago, where Visa introduced a new payment specification, 2.0 or higher, that devices had to support. And again, for security purposes. In 2019, the MasterCard contactless kernel version 3.0 was mandated. It's a bit of a mouthful. Again, all it means is that the kernel or the software that resides on the device itself that accepts the payment needs to be at a particular version in order to support the security mandated by MasterCard. In 2019, MagStripe was no longer supported by Visa. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And in April 2023, MagStripe contactless was no longer supported by MasterCard. A little bit of an insider secret is that MagStripe is still supported. And it's supported because if they were going to completely disable it, it would be very disruptive to industries such as parking and other industries that rely on unattended terminals. So terminals where there's nobody accepting the payment, can't give you feedback on what's happening. So it's still accepted, but it's discouraged. And when they say not supported, what it really means is that if you had a transaction that was conducted on a magnetic stripe card or using the magnetic stripe, you are not protected if you get a disputed charge on your card. So if you ever call the bank and say, I don't recognize this charge, I used my card at a gas station. Anybody ever had their card compromised at a gas station? Yes, a lot of people, for sure. Happens all the time. And the reason is because of the data that's on the MagStripe. It's not enciphered, it's plain text data, meaning you can go to AliExpress and buy a MagStripe encoder decoder, swipe the card, read a card, and replicate that card multiple times. And the data is static, meaning it does not change between transactions. So it's plain text, you read it, you replicate it, read it, replicate it, read it, replicate it. You can create as many copies of cards as you want. And now, if you have a copied card that's out in the market, and somebody else uses it for fraudulent purposes, or tries to take money from your account, the merchant is not protected from that chargeback liability. The merchant will have to pay. So it's unfortunate. There's no protection because the merchant allowed that transaction to go through. That's why it's not supported. It's not that it's going to get blocked today, but it is not supported. So it's important to understand these things, particularly in industries such as e-commerce where there are a lot of disputed charges. Even though MagStripe isn't necessarily used in e-commerce, the data that's on the stripe can be pulled and used in an e-commerce environment. The other way that the networks are disincentivizing the use of older MSD data transactions is by increasing the cost of acceptance associated with these transactions. On average, in effective May 2020, it started costing merchants 30 basis points more per transaction to accept an MSD transaction. It is the highest interchange rate, and when I say interchange is the biggest piece of the pie when it comes to the cost of payment processing. There's other minor fees, but interchange represents about 70–75% of the fee that merchants pay on a per transaction basis. So 30 basis points higher. The average interchange for a tap transaction is probably around 1%. And if you go to, if you use a magstripe, it's probably 1.32-ish, depending on the network you use. So it's a way to disincentivize, effective in 2020, the use of MSD transactions and encourage the use of chip transactions. So we'll talk a little bit about MasterCard MSD contactless acceptance. In 2022, new contactless enabled terminals were only to support EMV, which is the chip technology. That is, MasterCard allowed existing terminals in field to continue to accept, but new terminals that are being sent out to new merchants or being replaced or refreshed, they must only support EMV. And April 1st, 2023, all contactless enabled terminals were only to support EMV and not MSD. Now we see MSD traffic still coming through, as I said, but there are some risks associated with it, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And Visa has decided to introduce a fee of 15 cents USD that's going to apply to each transaction initiated from terminals that do not support EMV technology. Each transaction is going to draw 15 cents. Sometimes the fees that you pay are not even 15 cents. So you can imagine kind of the impact that this might have. This took effect April 1st of this year, and you may be impacted by it, so you may see something coming up on upcoming invoices. And by October 15th, both attended and unattended terminals must support EMV chip technology. Unattended is very common in the parking space. There's very few attended terminals anymore, and so this would apply. And we talked a little bit about the liability shift as well with chargebacks. MasterCard has introduced, they were going to introduce in October the MasterCard M-Chip Deployment Performance Program. It's a bit of a mouthful, and M-Chip is just how MasterCard has branded this program, but it's very similar to the Visa program. But effective next year in November, there's going to be a fee of $5 USD that's going to apply to two scenarios. One where there's an outdated software kernel, 3.0, again for security reasons, or where public cryptographic keys are outdated. This is actually very rare. The outdated keys is a rare occurrence. We don't see a lot of that. But the key is that if you have an old terminal that likely supports old software, that likely supports MSD traffic, you may get dinged with this fee. So again, the whole story is disincentivizing, but at some point, it's probably going to come to a stop, which means that every time you use a card at a terminal, when you dip it, you swipe it, or tap it, the terminal sends across the network all the way to the issuer what's called a POS, point of sale, entry mode, how that card was entered. And that entry mode determines your interchange, determines a bunch of other factors, but it also determines whether or not that transaction gets approved. So if the issuer or Visa and MasterCard decide to put a hard block on POS entry mode 91, which represents MSD transactions, which they can very easily do, it would completely cut off the ability to process using that terminal. So it could be very severe in the future. And they could do that anytime without notice. One other mandate that's somewhat related, less related to MSD and chip, but more so related to security and cryptography, is the Interact mandate to support double-length keys, 128-bit keys. The single-length keys, that data encryption standard was probably introduced in the 70s, and it was used up until about very recently, 2022. So Interac is mandating that the industry move to double length keys, 128-bit encryption across the board. Again, a reason to keep devices fresh and new and prevent old technology from tarnishing the environment. So how do these impact your business? I think I've talked a little bit about that, but I'll just do a quick recap here. So legacy terminals may be unable to comply with new mandates. So there may be more mandates that we get about, I'm going to say on the order of 450 to 500 mandates a year that Moneris has to comply with. A handful of those actually impact merchants, but many of them impact them quite severely. And so we have to understand that at any point in time, a mandate may come out where terminals are just simply unable to comply. That scenario where I talked about, where if the Visa and MasterCard, et cetera, put a hard block on a particular POS entry mode, that would essentially mean an inability to process transactions in some cases, especially if your device is so out of date is that it only accepts MST transactions. We talked about some of the additional fees that may apply. And if you think that, or if you know that your terminals are out of date, you should contact your operator, in this case Precise, contact Precise, and your account manager should be able to help you out in terms of an upgrade. Obviously cost savings, not just the potential for the inability to process transactions, but rather non-compliance fees. We talked about 15 cents per transactions from a device that only supports MSC. And we talked about the $5 USD fine for MasterCard, which by the way will escalate each year. So the year after it'll go to $8 per terminal, and the year after it'll go to $12 per terminal. So really, really important if you want to save costs in the future, and if you're incurring those costs today, it may be better to invest in the newer technology up front and avoid the progression of the costs increasing to the business. Minimizing fraud liability risk. We have seen as of very recently, one recent case where a merchant who was running a gas station, an automated fuel dispenser, didn't realize that one of their automated fuel dispensers at one location was accepting MST transactions, which they're not supposed to. And what happened was they had an exploit where a bunch of Scotiabank cards were copied and replicated, and they were used at this AFD. So somebody had some inside information about the terminals, and when this merchant tried to appeal the disputes that came forth as a result, they failed and they lost on the order of about $30,000. So not fun. So there is a lot of risk associated with it, and chip essentially eliminates almost all of the fraud risk associated with this. When you use a chip card, there's data on the card, data on the chip that changes with each transaction. MSD transactions are static plain text. Chip transactions are enciphered and encrypted transactions. So if I go to Tim Hortons and I buy a coffee and I tap my card, there's something on the chip called the application transaction counter, which increments by 1 each time you do a transaction. And because you're passing that data back to the issuer can see where the count is for the transaction. So if somebody captured my chip data from my Tim Hortons transaction and tried to use it, it would keep telling them the same count for the transaction. The issuer would automatically decline. It wouldn't be incrementing. And so that's just one example of the dynamic chip data that is captured on each transaction, which eliminates the fraud liability risk. And of course, you want to stay compliant with PCI, which means you got to keep your terminals up to date with PCI PTS. So takeaways. The mandates reflect the best practices, and currently they're encouraged, but that's quickly going to change. That's going to change to a point where there's going to be a hard cutoff at some point. We can see it coming, although it hasn't been announced. The networks are in constant discussions with us about MST traffic. They keep asking us about particular instances where they're seeing high volumes of MST traffic, and so they're really looking at eliminating it. And it means that some legacy equipment may require an upgrade. So it's something that you may want to consider. Again, it may be an immediate cost, but I think there's long-term savings associated with newer technology. And there's an opportunity to adapt new solutions and prepare you for the future. We always have innovation coming forth in the payments industry. I basically don't even carry around my cards anymore. I just tap my phone everywhere I go. My tap limit is $250. 80% of all transactions in Canada are initiated by tap. So you can think about kind of where the industry is going. Not to mention, at some point, issuers that issue cards are going to begin issuing cards without the magnetic stripe. So if your terminal only accepts magnetic stripes, that's it. You can't really accept the payment. So it's really, really important to adopt some of these new solutions.